Hello and welcome to this Cyber Talk webinar and data privacy and protection strategies to secure sensitive information. My name is Pedro Machado. I am very excited to be sharing with you a topic that is so special to me. Well, in a nutshell, I am a country senior director with the role of data protection officer for Ageas Portugal Group, which operates in the financial sector, especially with the leading marketing position in life and non-life insurance, health, and pension funds, being part of one of the most successful bancassurance channel in Europe. In academic terms, I am pursuing a PhD and already have 2 master's degrees, several post-graduations, an MBA, and 2 bachelor degrees. Furthermore, I am also a professor at several universities. Professionally and associatively, I have a passion for cybersecurity, information security, privacy, data protection domains, all of them. So I have to try to have an active participation in several European forums, allowing me to share and also learn from the experience of other professionals as well. You know, I like to reflect on lives and through that simplicity, try to learn from some experience. And starting with sharing something more personal, more private. I grew up in a small old village, and when I was very young, my grandmother tried to convince me to eat, and honestly, just let me to confess, I was terrible to eat. I never had the appetite. So many times my grandmother let me go out to play and drop some small stones into a river very close to her house. And she told me, Pedro, eat your soup or the boogeyman and the bagman will come and take you away. And I, afraid of the boogeyman and the bagman, I decide to eat the soup. Over the years, I realized that was not true. That there was no boogeyman or bagman, and I stopped eating soup and convert myself to hamburgers and French fries. Well, if I had understood the importance of healthy eating, I would definitively convert to soup. However, given that what was driving me to eat was the fear of boogeyman and the bagman, when that fear disappeared, it replaced my willingness to eat those incredible and healthy soup. Of course, many of you may ask, what does this have to do with this session webinar? Well, my dear friends, everything. Because today, many organizations, they try to raise awareness about cybersecurity, information security, or personal data based on fear. The boogeyman and the bagman, for instance, what we listen in so many organizations, the fear of serious incidents, reputational damage, operational risks, the fear of regulators, the fear of authorities, etc., etc., etc. And in the meantime, we forget about the real benefits for the organizations when we comply with those obligations or practice. So please, I'm just not saying that such fear aren't impossible to occur, okay? And we should be alert, obviously. But what I'm trying to raise is that the main motivation should be the benefits and not the fear. Because if the foundation is the fear, and if such events not occur, then those topics will lose importance in the organizations in time, you know? So considering the diversity of the legal, regulatory, contractual, and standard requirements and the complexity involved, building a scalable privacy program is something that must be properly designed and planned by starting to identify the regulatory framework, extracting the requirements that should be complied by the organization. Although cannot be viewed in a silos, in isolation from the reality of the organization, should include the business with the focus on people, process, and technology to achieve the organization objectives in a balanced way. So, in other words, the focus of compliance cannot be based on the boogeyman or the bagman, but on the real benefits for the organization, which are often set by the legal requirements, contracts we have with other entities, such as customers, partners, suppliers, or other stakeholders, or even international standards recognized by the market. Obviously, all of them from a gradual perspective, continuously improving over the time. And what about the privacy and data protection programs? Well, since this webinar is being broadcast all over the world, please consider that we need to understand that there are local requirements that can be different by countries or regions. Nevertheless, I will try to share a perspective that remains as general as possible, so that everyone can benefit from it, regardless of the specifications of local requirements on each country. So privacy and data protection landscape is something that is constantly shifting, and new regulations are emerging globally, honestly, particularly in Europe. But as well, organizations must stay informed about those changes, and they should adapt their practices accordingly. So, as a key recommendations or key considerations, we can appoint the regulatory compliance, so the way that we will understand and adhere the applicable laws and regulations, and obviously this includes data breach notification requirements, data subject requests, and these requests can be access, rectification, erasure, etc. And also, for instance, the cross-border data transfer restrictions. That is also something very important for us. Another key consideration is the data minimization, as you see on the slide. So I'm talking about when we collect and process only strictly the data that is really necessary for a specific purpose. Another one is a purpose limitation, when we are using data only for the purpose for which it was collected. Transparency and consent, being transparent about data practices and obtaining informed consent from individuals were required. And last but not the least, security. When we are implementing appropriate technical and organization measures to protect data from unauthorized access, use, or even disclosure. So the reality is that scalability is crucial for privacy and data protection programs to remain effective as an organization grows. So in that point, we can say that key elements of a scalable program can include or should include centralized governance, the way that we establish a clear governance structure with defined rules and responsibilities for privacy. We know very well who will be accountable. This includes, for instance, also an appointed data protection officer or equivalent role. Another one is data inventory and mapping. So here we are talking about creating a comprehensive inventory of all data processed by the organization, including its location, purpose, legal basis for processing. So Data mapping helps to visualize data flows and identify potential privacy risks. Another one is privacy by design, so the way that we integrate privacy considerations into the design of new products, service, and systems from the outset. Standardized process is another one, when we are developing standardized process for handling data subject requests, conducting privacy impact assessments, the famous PIA, or the PIA data protection impact assessments when we are talking about a specific data protection regulation in Europe, the GDPR, and managing data breaches. And again, last but not the least, we also have, on the other hand, the technology solution. So the way that we leverage technology solutions, for instance, to automatize privacy tasks, such as data discovery, consent management, data breach detection, etc., etc. So by improving the strategy outline, the organizations can build robust privacy programs that protect data, comply with regulations, and foster trust with stakeholders. So continuous monitoring, adoption, and a robust privacy culture are something absolutely essential to achieve long-term success for any organization, my friends. And here you have an image that, as you see, describes a recommended approach in 7 steps to build a robust privacy programs. But how about the privacy data protection strategies? Well, in a nutshell, we can start, for instance, to conduct a privacy assessment, identifying gaps in existing privacy practice and prioritize areas for improvements, developing a privacy policy, so important, the way that we create a clear and comprehensive privacy policy that outlines the organization's data practice. After that, we have implement a data breach response plan, the way that we develop a plan for responding to data breaches, for instance, including notification procedures and remediation steps. Another one, to provide privacy training, when the way that we train employees or privacy on privacy principles and best practices, the way that they will become aware about all those topics. Another one very important, the way that we promote regulatory monitoring and audits, particularly audit privacy practices to ensure compliance and identify areas for improvement. So monitor and audit is something very important. And again, last but not the least, automate where possible. So we should pay attention, but not only to avoid some manual mistakes, the way that we'll be more efficient using technology, but we are talking about the use of technology to automate repetitive tasks such as data discovery, consent management, data subject request fulfillment, and etc., etc., etc. These are only a few examples. So fostering a privacy culture, this can be achieved through leadership commitment. The leadership commitment is something so important, okay? Because it is a way that the organization will be able to demonstrate a strong commitment to privacy from the senior management. We also have the employee training, providing regular privacy training to all employees, as I was describing in the previous slides. Communication, the way that we communicate privacy policies and procedures clearly and effectively. We also should consider incentives, the way that we recognize And more than that, the way that we will rewarding employees for their own good privacy practices and accountability. The way that employees hold accountable for privacy actions, particularly for violations, for privacy incidents. So please keep in mind that a strong privacy program really requires a culture of privacy awareness and accountability throughout the organization. So the modern privacy or data privacy and protection landscape is characterized by several key factors involving threats, when we have cyber attacks that are becoming more sophisticated, more frequent and targeted. And in that sense, organizations face threats from ransomwares, phishing, malwares, inside threats, etc. We also have to expand regulatory requirements. So data privacy regulations, like for instance in Europe, like I said, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, but we also have in USA the CCPA, the IPA for health, and others are becoming more stringent and geographically diverse. So compliance requires a comprehensive understanding of these regulations and their implications. Data proliferation is another one, and is when data is being generated and stored at an exponential rate across different platforms and locations, including on-premise servers, cloud environments, and also mobile devices. And increased data sensitivity. When the organizations are handling increasingly sensitive data, including personal information, financial records, and even intellectual property. So there are some key principles for scalable and agile data security to address, obviously, that challenge. The organizations must adopt security strategies that are both scalable and agile. And this involves embracing the following principles. As you see on the slide, risk-based approach, prioritize security efforts based on the level of risk associated with different data assets and business process, or for instance, when we are conducting risk assessment or regular risk assessment to identify vulnerabilities and potential threats. Another one is the defense in depth, when we are implementing multiple layers of security controls to protect data at different points in the data lifecycle. This also includes preventive, detective, and corrective controls, as you know. Another pillar is the automation and orchestration. So when we are automate security tasks and process to improve efficiency and also reduce the risk of human errors. So for instance, when we are using security orchestration tools to coordinate security response across different systems. Another one is continuous monitoring and improving. So when we are in a continuous monitoring security controls and process to identify weakness and areas for improvement, the regularly update security policies and procedures to reflect changes in the threat landscape and regulatory requirements, etc. The data minimization that I have previously mentioned, related with the collection and retain only the data that is strictly necessary for legitimate business purpose. When we are implementing data retention policies to ensure that data is deleted when it is no longer needed, for instance. Privacy by design, something so important, the way that we integrate privacy considerations into the design of new systems and process from the outset. Obviously, this helps to ensure that privacy is built into the systems rather than privacy added as an afterthought. Incident response planning, the way that we develop a comprehensive incident response plan to address data breach and other security incidents, the way that we regularly test the plan to ensure that that is effective. The employees' training and awareness, the way that we provide regular security awareness training to employees to educate them about risks of cyber attacks and how to protect sensitive data. Vendor risk management, another pillar that is so critical. The way that we assess security practices on third-party vendors who have access to sensitive data or to personal data in that case, implementing contracts that require vendors to comply with security standards. And we also have data encryption. I mean, the way that we encrypt sensitive data, both in transit and at rest, to protect it from unauthorized access. So the possible use of technologies is recommended. For instance, you can use cloud-native security, leverage cloud-native security service to protect data storage in the cloud. And obviously, this service provides features such as data encryption, access control, threat detection, etc. The EIM, the identity and access management, to implement systems to control access to the data, using multi-factor authentication, the MFA, to verify user identities, for instance. DLP, data loss prevention, the way that we deploy a solution to prevent sensitive data from leveraging or leaving the organization control. Security information and event management, CM, when we are using CM systems to, for instance, to collect and to analyze security logs from different systems, that this will help to identify and respond to security incidents. Vulnerability management, when we regularly will be able to scan systems for vulnerabilities and patch them promptly. And penetration testing, the way that we will be able to conduct regular tests or penetration tests to identify weakness in security controls. So we also have data anonymization technique has something very useful to protect personal data while preserving utility for analysis and research purposes. For instance, to secure data in transit and storage, or in privacy by design tasks integrating security across data lifecycle. So data anonymization is a good example about the way that we can explore methods from simple suppression to more complex techniques like differential privacy, highlighting their strengths, weakness, and suitability for different data types and use case. So it is the process of removing or modifying personal identifying information, the famous acronym PII, from datasets, obviously, and thereby preventing the identification of individuals. So the goal is to enable data sharing and analysis without compromising privacy. In the end, I can appoint there is something effective, or if we use effective anonymization techniques, we are using something crucial for complying with data protection regulations while still allowing valuable insights to be extracted from the data. For instance, for the business to have more business data to predict some trends, customer trends, to improve product, service, etc. So one relevant technique is suppression that I was referring previously. So suppression is when we, or involves the removing specific data elements that could potentially identify an individual, a data subject. And this is, I can say that this is the simplest form of anonymization, okay? We can say as a technique, we're talking about deleting or redacting specific attribute that could be a field, a name, address, a phone, for instance, that we don't have here in this slide, but this is another example, etc., etc., etc. So in the perspective of strengths, it's easy to implement. In the perspective of weakness, this can lead to a significant data loss and reduced analytical value. And why? Because we are removing data. So when we are removing a field, it can be an employee ID, a name column from a customer database, yes, I am using suppression to anonymize. Nevertheless, I really need to pay attention what I'm doing with the data set. Otherwise, this can lead to a significant data loss, or as I said, reduce the analytical value of the data. But in the end, is a very common technique. Another relevant technique is the generalization. The generalization is a way that you will replace specific values with broader categories or range. So technically, it's replacing precise values with less specific ones. For instance, when we replace age, as you see here, age ranges, specific location with a broader region, etc., etc. So on one hand, the strengths are the way that we preserve some data utility while reducing identifiability. But on the other hand, the weakness is the way that we can still be vulnerable to re-identification if not carefully implemented, So a good example that you have here is replacing a specific age with age range between 20 to 29, 30 to 39, or so we need to pay attention. Otherwise, we will be able or vulnerable to re-identify again the data subjects, and obviously with that we will compromise or break the anonymization technique. But data generalization, it is something very, very relevant. Another one is masking. Masking, that is very, very common. For instance, when we are using the credit cards, I think that most of you know that. So masking replaces sensitive data with artificial values. It's using the replacement of real data with random or placeholder value. For instance, as I said, the replacing credit card numbers with fake numbers or asterisk. So the strength is that we are really protecting the original data. The weakness is that the masked data is not useful for analysis unless the masking method preserves the statistical properties, okay? I don't have time to that, but if you look for your credit card, the number, there are a lot of groups that have a specific representation and identify the entity, the bank entity, and or the country, or etc. etc. So pay attention when you are using mask. On one hand, you know that you'll be able to guarantee that you'll preserve the anonymization, but on the other hand, ensure that you are preserving statistical properties in a good way. Okay, so every time that you are replacing numbers with a series of X or asterisks, pay attention to that. Pseudonymization replace the identifying attributes with pseudonyms or codes. You know, it is a way, it is something, and this is funny because usually in the data protection community there is a lot of misunderstandings about anonymization and pseudonymization, but pseudonymization is a sub-technique of the anonymization techniques in total. It's one of them, and pseudonymization is when we are replacing identifying attributes with pseudonyms or codes, as I was describing. Is a way that you replace direct identifiers with artificial identifiers. For instance, when you replace names with unique IDs, or the link between the pseudonym and the real identifier is stored separately and securely. So on one hand, the strongest is that it will allow for re-identification if it is necessary, for instance, for research purpose, obviously with the consent. On the other hand, the weakness is that it will require secure management of the pseudonymization key, not considered full anonymization under GDPR, for instance, if the key exists, okay? So here you have a good example, replacing customer names with unique customer IDs, for instance. Another technique is data swapping. Data swapping exchange values between records for specific attributes. You know, it is when you use randomly swapping values for certain attributes between different records in the data set. So the strength is that it will preserve statistical properties of the data. On the other hand, the weakness is that it can distort relationship between attributes. Okay, so as a good example, when we are, for instance, swapping the salary value between two different employees, you can see that I think that swapping is a very good technique, but we also need to understand the way that we are swapped. Another one is data perturbation, and perturbation is a technique that we will be adding noise or random variation to the data. Okay, so in this technique you are adding random noise to numerical data, or slightly modifying categorical data, for instance. So the strongest attribute or value is that you'll be able to preserve statistical properties while obscuring individual values. As the weakness, we can introduce inadvertently inoccurrences and affect the reliability of analysis. So please take care, because there is something, the data perturbation, it is something that on one hand it is an efficient way to preserve statistical properties, on the other can affect the reliability of the analysis. So as an example that you see, when, for instance, when we are adding a small random number to each patient blood pressure reading, for instance, it's a good example. Differential privacy. Differential privacy is when you add carefully, or when we are calibrated noise to the results of queries on the data. So this technique is when we are adding noise to query results in a way that limits the information revealed about the individual records. The straight is that provides a strong mathematical guarantee of privacy. On the other hand, the weakness is that can be complex to implement and may reduce the accuracy of the query results. So it requires carefully selection of property or privacy parameters. So when we are adding noise to the count of the patients with a specific disease, it's also a good example. As you see here, for instance, this is a good example. Suppose that an operator, a system operator, cannot run a query to see if Bob, and suppose that the column X and the column Y have different interpretations. As you see in the slide, X means in a Boolean term if that persons are sick or not, and severity if they are in a critical phase or not. And suppose that that system operator cannot check if Bob is sick or not and what is the severity level that he have. Nevertheless, and this is something that is very common when we run for dashboards and other kind of data production on the companies, he cannot access directly to Bob fields, but he can in aggregate view to produce a sum of all the parameters, all the amounts, all the fields, that exist in the column X and the column Y. So if you run a sum of all values, including Bob, and minus the summatory of all of them, Bob minus 1, so you will see that until Bob you have 1 that came from Alice, 1 that came from Jean, 0 for Mary, 0 for Dave, and 1 for Bob. So we are talking about, in the end, 3 minus Bob minus 1. So the summatory until Dave, 1 plus 1 plus 0 plus 0, that is 2. So 3 minus 1 means that, yes, the value for Bob is 1, means that Bob is sick. Okay? So it is very critical to pay attention for that way, because nowadays we implement a lot of controls in our companies to guarantee that that we have techniques to solve a lot of privacy issues, but sometimes using differential privacy techniques you'll be able to compromise or to conclude that we are not so protected as we would like to be. To finalize, considerations for choosing the technique. So the choice of anonymization technique, for instance, depends on several factors: the data type, as was describing, the different techniques suitable for different type of data, for instance, numerical, categorical, text, etc. The data utility, and the goal in that case is to minimize data loss while maximizing privacy. The risk of re-identification, the way that we are assess the potential for re-identification based on the availability data and the external sources. The regulatory requirements, the way that we are complying with relevant data protection regulations, as I said, GDPR, CCPA, etc. Computational costs is something additionally relevant. So the way that to use techniques more computationally intense than others. So to conclude that, selecting the appropriate technique, it requires careful consideration of the data type, desired level of privacy, and the intended use of the data, So the combination of techniques in some cases may be necessary. to achieve the desired balance between privacy and utility. So please keep in mind regular review and update strategies to address evolving privacy risks and regulatory requirements. Thank you very much for your attention, for your kind attention, and obviously I'll be at your disposal. Thank you so much. Good point. Well, the standards are a good basis. Nevertheless, you should particularly pay attention for your legal requirements, because most of the people think that they will comply if they will be complying, they will comply with all obligation if they comply with a specific standard. So ISO, any of the ISO 27000 family or other type, it is a good basis, For instance, if you implement an ISO 27001, you'll have an information security management system, very well designed. You can look, for instance, for the ISO 27002 that you have describe all the controls and the way that we will implement them, that are the differential about the next A of ISO 27001. But you can keep going, and ISO 27004, you have a good way to monitor them, 5 for risk management, etc., etc., etc. But please, don't keep you in mind that you'll be complying with everything related with privacy using an ISO standard or a NIST or other, okay? You should, first you should look for your legal environment, what kind of legal obligations you have to comply. Try to desmaterialize them in requisites, organize all those requisites. After that, you should look for the best standard that fits into your organization, okay? Some will appoint ISO, others will prefer NIST, others will prefer other approach. But no matter what, try to use them, those that are best fit for your organization. And also keep in mind, as I was describing in the presentation, that you should also consider the contractual relationship that you have with other stakeholders, okay? Contracts that you have with partners, with providers, sometimes with customers, and you should collect all the final requirements. You will conclude that most of the cases you have overlap requirements, so you should try to hygienize, to harmonize all that pool of requirements, and that's in the final you will have what you should look as the requirements list to comply, okay? For me, this is my advice. Well, from the beginning, if we have identified all the requirements, applicable requirements, particularly those that came from law, because even when we talk about requirements, there are some mandatory requirements and others that are not mandatory, okay? If we have some requirements that came from the law, those are mandatory requirements, okay? The others, for instance, when I look for ISO, that other colleague shared that question previously, the ISO standards are not mandatories, okay? It's mandatory for those that want to comply with them, okay? But if I'm not complying with the specific standards, I don't receive a penalty, I don't commit a criminal act. But if I am not complying with the law, I will have some consequence. So even though all that requirements that I was describing should be, and that's why obviously I'm trying to describe these in a high level, but if you want to go deeper, obviously the list of requirements. You should harmonize them in different domains, the way that you should, even to simplify the report, But after that, you should also have a column, for instance, that you describe if the requisite is mandatory or not. And if you are complying with all the requirements, the mandatory requirements, good, you are complying. Even that you are not complying with a not mandatory requirement, but is something that you recognize that could be something important to have, You call them as a requirement, but it's not a mandatory. Even that you are not complying with them, in the end, yes, we are complying. So pay attention to them. For instance, in Europe, maybe could be more easy for me to give this example, but I would like to do not focus in Europe because obviously other colleagues that are here from the United States, from Africa or from Asia or whatever, they have different perceptions, they have different laws, the legal environment is different. But for instance, if in Europe we have a global regulation that all EU member states should comply, the General Data Protection Regulation, but considering that the GDPR, it is something that, well, using the famous quote, one size does not fit all, and it's difficult to have a legal obligation that will be applicable to all EU member states independent of the reality. So for instance, I am based in Portugal. Portugal have a GDP totally different if you compare with Germany. Germany is the third biggest world economy, okay? So obviously in the penalties that GDPR establish, the amounts are very high. Why? Because it needs to be something that is recognized as a penalty that provokes pain for a company in Portugal, but also for a company in the third biggest world economy, in Germany. This is the two different realities just to give the perception about it. So this means that, for instance, there are some specific topics that locally should be regulated per member state. So independent of the fact I can have operations in the whole Europe, and one colleague say I am 100% complying with privacy and data protection regulations, okay? But he needs to comply with GDPR and the local law. In Portugal, I have GDPR, but I have also local law. So, for instance, the local law will regulate what the GDPR cannot cover. For instance, the personal data of dead people. When we talk about minors, what is minors? Who is the local data protection authority? So all those topics and others, this is just examples, are something that have local constitutional implications, etc. So the local law should regulate that kind of specifications. So when we say when we'll be complying with all the privacy, well, is that when we will be complying, respecting all the mandatory applicable requirements that our organization needs to comply. But previously, you should do the work to identify all that regulations, check, as I said, just to guarantee that you'll be more efficient, dismaterialize in requirements, and check if we have overlaps or not, and ensure each by one if we are complying or not. You can do that through assessments that I don't like very much. I prefer audits. I prefer to go into the field because the level of accuracy and the level of assurance is totally different. If I go into the field, collect evidence, and it's totally different than send a questionnaire to a system owner or data owner or business process owner that will respond to me, yes, I comply with everything. even that I ask, please, could you attach an evidence? Maybe he will attach the best evidence that will be in line what he needs or wants to say, but don't assure that we are really complying. I don't know if I am totally clear, but this is something that are here. What I'm saying, what I'm describing, have a lot of tricks that we need to pay attention to ensure. In the end, we really need to ensure with evidence that we are really complying. Otherwise, this is just an illusion, a cognitive perception, but it is most a cognitive bias than the reality. If they don't use user data, in that sense, it's out of the scope for privacy topics, okay? So we are just talking about a control that will ensure the security of the systems. Those systems, in the end, yes, they will be able to process personal data, but specifically that IAM if they don't have user data, we will have a very simplified basis. Yes, it is to pay attention. First, my dear friends, let's keep our eyes or let's focus on the benefit for the organization. Let's insist on this kind of pitch, okay? The focus of the monsters and the bagman, as I was describing, is something that's it's not sustainable. Secondly, you should pay attention for the real requisites applicable, okay? Because in the end, what we are contributing is something very important for all the global society, okay? Because you are dealing with fundamental rights and freedoms. So this is something that we should understand with passion, and we should always be studying, because this is a polymorphic topic, are always changing the form, the way. So let's keep connected. I think that it's also important, and congratulations, Shilpa, for EC Council to promote these webinars and all those forums, because I think that the way that we are most connected will be more profitable, and it will be more graceful for us to increase our knowledge, our experience. Thank you for that.